Which empire collapsed for the most interesting reason? Story 1. The Western satraps in India are one of my favorites. They began as a leftover fragment of the Indo-Scythian Empire and were originally subordinate to the Kushans. When the Kushan Empire collapsed, the satraps stepped into the power vacuum and effectively rebuilt themselves into a regional empire. Their downfall is wild. After defeating the neighboring Gupta kingdom, King Rudrasima III demanded a woman from the Gupta royal family as tribute for his harem. The Gupta king ordered his brother's lover to go. What neither ruler knew was that the Gupta prince Chandragupta disguised himself as his lover, while his most elite soldiers posed as her attendants. They were welcomed into the satrap court without suspicion, then massacred the king and the entire ruling elite. The empire collapsed almost instantly, overthrown by a small group of soldiers in disguise. Story 2. The Qin dynasty in China, early 1st century AD, is a great example of how ideology can destroy a state. It replaced the Western Han dynasty, but only lasted about 14 years. Its founder was obsessed with reviving ancient customs and laws from the Zhou dynasty, systems that were already 1,000 years outdated by that point. He tried to recreate an idealized past that no longer fit reality, and the results were catastrophic. Economic reforms failed, administration broke down, alliances collapsed, and military policy became incoherent. It was basically things were better back then, nostalgia taken to a fatal extreme. Story 3. Not technically an empire, but Sparta's collapse is deeply ironic. Sparta's warrior society depended on massive enslavement. For every Spartan citizen, there were roughly 7 helots. Maintaining that system required constant military surveillance to prevent uprisings, draining resources and attention. Sparta's deeper issue was social rigidity. While citizens could easily lose their status, there was no path for anyone to gain citizenship. Helots couldn't earn freedom, and outsiders couldn't be integrated. Meanwhile, Spartan men died faster than they could be replaced. Their system slowly hollowed itself out. Story 4. The fall of the Abbasid Caliphate must have felt apocalyptic at the time. When the Mongols arrived in the 13th century, it likely seemed as if the greatest civilization on earth was being erased by something almost alien in nature. That said, the Abbasids had been declining for centuries. By the 1200s, they barely controlled parts of Mesopotamia. Their former territories had already been carved up by the Ayyubids, Khwarezmians, Arabian kingdoms, and countless local rulers. The Mongols didn't destroy a thriving empire. They delivered the final blow to a fractured one. Story 5. The Indus Valley civilization wasn't an empire in the traditional sense, but it may have been the most advanced society of its era. Despite its sophistication, urban planning, sanitation, standardized measurements, we know shockingly little about it. The dominant theory is that climate collapse and prolonged drought ended it, but we can't be sure. Their script remains undeciphered, and their language is lost. Even worse, their writing style, often boustrophoedon, makes interpretation even harder. An entire civilization vanished, leaving behind cities but no readable voice. Story 6. The Mughal Empire's collapse is a classic betrayal story. One of its provincial commanders turned on the emperor in exchange for British backing and nominal rule. In reality, he became a puppet while the British took control. It mirrors what happened at the end of China's Ming dynasty, where internal rebellion and betrayal sealed the empire's fate. In China's case, a key general guarding a vital mountain pass defected after rebels captured his family. In both cases, internal fractures mattered far more than foreign armies. Story 7. The fall of Constantinople is often framed around Orban and his cannon. Orban, an engineer, first offered his services to the Byzantines, but they couldn't afford him. He then sold his expertise to the Ottomans, building the massive cannons that breached Constantinople's walls. That said, the city was already doomed. Byzantium was fragmented, impoverished, and largely abandoned by its former territories. Much of Anatolia had already surrendered without resistance. The cannon sped things up, but the empire was already on life support. Story 8. The Russian Empire's collapse is almost surreal. Its leadership was staggeringly incompetent, corruption was everywhere, and the royal family placed enormous trust in Rasputin, a deeply untrustworthy mystic. That said, Rasputin's role is often exaggerated. His influence mattered less than the perception of his influence. Even after his death, nothing improved, which shattered public faith in the monarchy. A decaying mid-tier empire gave way to one of the most powerful and terrifying states in modern history. Story 9. The Neo-Babylonian empires didn't fall in a particularly strange way. It was conquered by Cyrus the Great, but its last king was deeply odd. Nabonidus became king unusually late in life, possibly through a coup involving his son. His mother, possibly of Assyrian royal descent, reportedly believed the moon god Sin destined him to rule. Nabonidus spent nearly a decade of his reign living in Taima, an oasis far from Babylon. Why he did this remains unknown. His son, and possibly his elderly mother, governed in his absence. His religious reforms and aloofness may have alienated elites, making Cyrus seem like a liberator rather than a conqueror. Story 10. Portugal's empire didn't end because of the Lisbon earthquake, but the timing was brutal. By 1755, Portugal was already in decline. Incompetent monarchs, Spanish domination, and colonial losses had weakened it long before the disaster. The empire was being propped up almost entirely by Brazilian gold. Ironically, the earthquake empowered one of Portugal's greatest statesmen, the Marquês de Pombal. He oversaw Lisbon's reconstruction with modern urban planning, wide boulevards, rational layouts, and seismic-resistant buildings. Story 11. The Habsburgs. They became the royal families of a bunch of European kingdoms and kept power in the family by marrying within the family, but the entire family became badly inbred. The Spanish Habsburgs became so inbred they couldn't reproduce, while they all exhibited facial deformities, the famous Habsburg jaw, which got more and more severe with each inbreeding, and cognitive handicaps. The various branches of the Habsburg family tree folded in on itself until they inbred themselves to death, and then they lost power across Europe. Edit. Apparently they were not out of power for real until World War I, and inbreeding primarily destroyed the Spanish branch. I just looked up how many kingdoms this family ruled. According to Google, Spain, Portugal, Hungary, Bohemia, Croatia, Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, Lombardy, Venetia, and the Holy Roman Empire, plus vast territories in the Low Countries, Belgium or Luxembourg, Austria, and parts of modern-day Poland, Romania, and ex-Yugoslavia. Story 12. The fall of the Incan Empire is tragic and fascinating. At the Battle of Cajamarca, 168 Spaniards defeated about 8,000 Incas and captured Atahualpa, the Incan emperor. This was possible because the Incas had never really encountered horses, guns, and steel armor before, and were surprised by the attack, and because Incan battle tactics placed the leader towards the front line, as opposed to European tactics where leaders stayed to the rear. A relatively small number of Spaniards were able to defeat and overthrow one of the largest, most developed and sophisticated empires in the New World in a very short amount of time. Story 13. Qin Dynasty. Qin Shi Huang basically ends himself because of his obsession with immortality, and his designated heir is fooled into committing suicide, leaving the empire to be destroyed through the machinations of a eunuch and puppet emperor. Imagine exerting effort to unite all of China only to lose it all after the death of the first emperor. Sui Dynasty overly conscripts peasants in building mega projects, which causes a revolt that destroys the empire, which just existed in 37 years. Story 14. The Scottish Empire. It lasted 2 years, taking 2/5 of the entire wealth of the nation. Our nobility ancestors set out to establish its empire in Panama, as they recognized it would be the trade route to have in this new world. They brought oats to grow porridge and lots of woolly jumpers in case it was cold, for their new life on the equator. The Spanish didn't like them, but neither did the locals. There'd be no Thanksgiving. They couldn't work out how to grow food, so they ate what they'd brought and lasted until summer, when most of them caught and died from malaria or disease. They did catch some turtles, which kept them alive a bit longer, but then drank alcohol, which kept them alive a lot shorter. Scotland's king, meanwhile, ordered that no help be given at all, because he was also England's king, a nation independent of Scotland, and had a lot of vested interest with the Dutch and all that Spanish succession thing, and the poor wee innocent creature had no thoughts at all of economically destroying Scotland and bringing it under the dominion of the Kingdom of England. Nope, not at all. He wouldn't. Not the King of Scotland. Story 15, the Russian Empire under the Tsars. It was basically what happens when the head of state's every decision is a PR disaster. The country lost a war with Japan despite having greater numbers. The country was at war with Germany, so the head of state left to fight the war, leaving the governing to his German-born wife and a crazy hobo priest who was frequently accused of misconduct, and rather than actually freeing the people from lives as serfs, he said they were freed, but had to still work to pay off the losses suffered by their former owners. Story 16. Assyria was demolished. For most of the empire's existence, their various subjects and rivals hated each other as much as they despised Assyria, and power more or less remained in an equilibrium. Then when things were going great from an Assyrian perspective in the early or mid-Iron Age, the emperor at the moment decided to completely decimate one particular ethnic group in what is now southern or western Iran and eastern Iraq. This created a bit of a local power vacuum and set off a chain of events that would eventually result in the rise of the Persian Empire. But first things first, all the various smaller powers in the region decided to put aside their differences for just long enough to join forces. Together, they were strong enough to completely wipe Assyria from the face of the earth, in a political context, in a very short time. Assyria went from easily being king of the world to a few scattered farm villages in a matter of a few years for no other reason than an ego-driven own goal. Story 17. I think the Han Empire had a fairly interesting collapse. The Chinese believed that it was too dangerous to keep fertile men in the company of royal women, so they only allowed the emperor to be surrounded by women and eunuchs. So you'd have these two powerful groups, vying for control over young Han Dynasty emperors. It wasn't uncommon for young princes to be poisoned or murdered, and whichever group had the most influence would control the Chinese political sphere. Often, once a prince got too old and was hard to control, they just found some way to end them. This led to the slow decline and destruction of the Han Dynasty from the inside out. Many emperors just lived in their palace, banging their concubines and being fed lies by the royal court, while the country was breaking apart around them. The eunuchs eventually met their demise, but the damage was already done, and the destruction of the unified Chinese empire was not far behind. Story 18. The US empire collapsed due to a reality TV star. Yes, that's a big contender. It started with a bunch of very intelligent people finding an excellent way to use complicated ideas for the greater good of all. Then later, the population just got stupider and stupider until the majority of the population sucked hard at the dirty teat of the propaganda machine until they feared and hated the very idea of the greater good of all, and the very basis of democracy didn't work. Fascinating. Just fascinating. Story 19. The Germans' misguided attempt to invade the Soviet Union through Operation Barbarossa, and the horror the Germans wrought on civilians through the Blitzkrieg and their occupational death camps to root out Judeo-Bolshevism will always be the stuff of legend. The invasion, along with Stalin's preceding and subsequent actions in response, has largely defined international politics for nearly 100 years and ended Western Europe prospects as an independent military power. Story 20. Enron. Financial empire, but it counts. Collapsed because of financial voodoo hiding real conditions. Crushed by the street. Want to have your faith in humanity the opposite of restored? The accounting firm that helped Enron cook all their books, Arthur Andersen, still exists today and provides consulting services to governments and big companies. The only difference is they're technically not allowed to provide accounting services anymore, and they changed their name to Accenture to get away from the bad PR. Also, I wonder if Enron happened today, would it even be that big of a deal? It feels like the economy is becoming more and more dominated by grift. Ever since 99% of Wall Street got away with zero consequences after 2008, it feels like no one has any faith in the system anymore. People just expect corporations to grift, so when it turns out they do, no one is surprised, no one is outraged, and we all just move on. Since then, we've had so much grift, including the crypto space being dominated by it. Story 21, the Song Dynasty of China due to hubris. The Khitan-led Liao dynasty ruled over the lands of the Mongolian plateau. The Han Chinese-led Song dynasty coveted an area called the 16 provinces under the Liao control. So the Song allied with the Jurchens, based around Manchuria, who were ruled under the Liao to destroy the Liao and divide their territory. It's a long story, so this is basically a summary off the top of my head. The Jurchens ended up doing most of the heavy lifting and were not impressed with the performance of the Song armies, so they reneged on their agreement of the territory that would be divided up. The Song decided to invade the Jin only to be beaten back, so the Song negotiated a peace treaty in which they basically paid tribute to Jin. The Song decided to invade the Jin again. At that point, the Jurchens were fed up and marched right into the Song capital of Bianjing, present-day Kaifeng, in an incident known as the Jingkang Incident. A majority of the imperial court was abducted and brought back to the Jin capital. Treasures and anything of value was stripped from the imperial capital. It is arguably one of the major events in classical Chinese history that set their civilization back. Those who were able to evade capture fled to southern China and established the Southern Song dynasty. They ended up working with the Mongols to destroy the Jin. But in turn, it was the Mongols who ended up destroying the Southern Song and establishing the Yuan dynasty. Story 22, Rome. They overextended the size of an empire which they could govern with their system, and subsequently fell, because expanding territory, looting and making prisoners of war slaves was a key pillar of their economy. This gets repeated a lot, but doesn't really match with history. Rome's expansion was all but over by the time the first emperor died. There were a few bits and pieces added later, Britain, Dacia, but for the most part, Imperial Rome wasn't big into expansion, much less to the point where conquest was a key pillar of its economy. And even ignoring the long, slow centuries of the East, the Western Empire lasted for hundreds of years after the final conquest. A huge amount of ink has been spilled about the fall of Rome, but if I had to boil it down, I'd probably say it was its inability to properly handle succession, a poor job integrating military and civilian society that left the army with little loyalty towards society itself, and an obsession with religious uniformity. First anti-Christian, then anti-not the right kind of Christianity. Story 23. The Soviet Union, an empire that expanded aggressively through war, held its dominions in check with violence and repressed its people. Eventually, people just decided to leave. There was very limited violence, until later. It's truly a unique story as far as I am aware. I can't think of another empire in history that just willingly stopped existing. The Soviet Union collapsed due to external military pressure, having to spend enormous amounts of money to compete with NATO, increase in military spending, losing in Afghanistan, while at the same time losing revenue, stagnating economy, sinking oil prices. Inflation shot up in the last years, adding to that political turmoil and a rise of nationalist movements. This doesn't really look that special. Story 24. The fall of the Soviet Union was started because Günter Schabowski, who was giving a press conference about travel restrictions between East and West Germany, misspoke. The change being announced was supposed to be that certain people could now apply for permission to cross the border to see friends or family, or for business purposes, and that applications would open in the coming days. Shabovsky misspoke and said that the law lifting restrictions on crossing the border went into effect immediately, without delay. Within 4 hours, the Berlin Wall had physically come down in some places due to crowds that had pulled it down with human might alone, and people were already crossing back and forth with no opposition within the first hour after the press conference aired. Demolition of the entire wall was complete within 7 months, and the Soviet Union fell entirely less than 2 years later, due to a variety of factors, including that critical misjudgment that allowed free border crossings between East or West Germany. Story 25. Rome, for many suspected reasons beyond direct failures of political economy. One idea is that their use of lead pipes and cups led to a drop in IQ and a surge in insanity. Another is the suspected eruption of Ilopango in what is now El Salvador. It caused a volcanic winter across the northern hemisphere and is thought to have toppled not just Justinian Rome, but the Aztecs as well, thanks to the mass starvation and famine and the political instability that comes along with starvation. In the case of Rome, this also exacerbated the plague. Story 26. The United States. Unsteady since its inception and held together only by systematic oppression, and always conveniently having another enemy to fight. The true collapse started in 1980 with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the election of Ronald Reagan as president. Reagan gave military support to religious fanatic rebels and slashed the tax rate for the highest income brackets. After the Soviet campaign failed due mainly to their own incompetence and crumbling economy, the US pulled out, leaving behind a religious cult that was very much accustomed to America, subsidizing its illegal activities. Cut to 40 years later, the rebels have pushed us out of their country after a 20-year war that accomplished absolutely nothing. The economy has crashed twice. The greatest epidemic the world has ever seen has claimed over 1 million American lives because each one of Reagan's successors had become increasingly incompetent, with the most recent one being a psychotic Nepo baby taking orders from that very evil empire Reagan harped on about. 250 years, all flushed down the toilet by 7 men. Story 27. The Khwarezmian Empire was destroyed by Genghis Khan. The Khan originally sent trade caravans and envoys, seeing the empire as an equal and potential trading partner. The first caravan was seized and the members were executed by the governor of Otrar on charges of espionage. Despite this, Genghis Khan sent 3 envoys to the Shah Muhammad II, demanding the governor be punished. The Shah executed one envoy and humiliated the other 2 by shaving their beards. Genghis abandoned his campaign against the Jin, China, and destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire in 3 years, ending 10 to 15 million. He then resumed his campaign against the Jin. Story 28. The American Empire. It collapsed because 1/3 of all adult Americans decided they'd be okay with Sieg Heiling, a demented orange-faced crap gibbon, thief, and an abuser. If the trade-off was that they could be as disgustingly prejudiced, racist out loud as their granddaddies were, another third spent 20 years staring at their own navels in order to avoid looking directly at the blinding implosion of their system of government, and the final third were too drunk, stoned, or bent over in a faint crouch to give a crap. Story 29. The US empire in 2025 has been a wild ride. Somehow, the US went from a semi-stable democracy to a nation led by a senile person who can't even speak properly, a billionaire with a chainsaw, a comically evil minister of war, and a random list of cartoonish sidekicks. And then there is the whole Epstein thing that is slowly unraveling, the alligator Alcatraz madness, the random threatening of allies, the random attacking of civilian boats, the manic posturing, the random deportation of people, and all sorts of other bizarre nonsense. There is the ominous threat, may you live in interesting times. Well, we are definitely living in interesting times, and the USA is doing very interesting things. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Story 30. The British Empire fell, the way a very confident person falls off a treadmill. loudly, awkwardly, and insisting they meant to do that. At its peak, Britain owned roughly a quarter of the planet and behaved like a landlord who had never once fixed the plumbing but still collected rent and tea, spices, and unquestioned authority. The empire ran on ships, maps colored pink, and the firm belief that everyone else would eventually thank them. Then reality arrived. 2 world wars politely but firmly emptied Britain's wallet, its manpower, and its patience. Colonies began asking dangerous questions like, "Why are we listening to you?" and "Could you maybe leave?" Britain responded with paperwork, committees, and the hope that saying Commonwealth would soften the breakup. India left first, slamming the door so hard it rattled the rest of the empire. Africa followed, the Middle East proved complicated, and suddenly Britain was downsizing faster than an aristocrat selling silverware to pay the heating bill. By the late 20th century, the empire was gone, replaced by a fond nostalgia, a few overseas territories, and the ability to say, "We used to rule the world" at dinner parties. Britain didn't so much lose the empire as misplace it while queuing, then decide it was all too much trouble to look for. In the end, the sun didn't set on the British Empire. It just politely excused itself, citing budget cuts and self-determination. Story 31, Tokugawa Shogunate. This would mark the first time the West interfered with an empire or country. First time? What? By the time of the Black Ships, second half of the 19th century, arriving in Japan and forcing the Tokugawa Bakufu to open up the Americas had been fully colonized. Africa was just split up, India was under British domain, etc. and etc. Do you mean the first time an outside force tried to interfere within Japan? And even then you would be wrong, as the Mongols, Yuan dynasty, for example, tried 2 separate invasions of Japan. Because your understanding of history and its timeline is pretty messed up. Story 32, probably those Mesoamerican ones. Like a worst-case H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds scenario. These aliens show up with all these weird animals or technology or strange new occult practices, and the locals are the ones decimated by disease. It wasn't really shocking like that. It has been overplayed. It was indeed confusing to see a cannon the first time and such, but it quickly dissipated. In the movie Apocalypto, they show the Maya as scared and confused of Spanish ships, for example. Meanwhile, in real life, the Spanish wrote how they got close to the shore and the locals immediately got they were big boats. Then they tried to get the Spanish further island away from the ships to end the entire expedition. The horse was actually explained as a large deer by some groups. By the time Cortez met Moctezuma, he was already aware firearms were some sort of tool, not insurmountable magic or anything. Story 33, the Tang Dynasty. At its peak, it is admitted they have reached a pre-industrial era before everyone else, and with quite an important scale. Think of industrial Europe, but without machinery. The Tangs could have ruled over Asia for a longer time than they did, if that wasn't for An Lushan's revolt. He was one of Emperor Xuanzong's favorite governors and therefore was given a lot of power. He used that power in a revolution that screwed over the Tang dynasty even though he lost. Millions of dead, famine, sickness, and 8 years of civil war. The turmoil left after that eventually weakened the Tang, annihilated their economy, demographics, and all their progress. And Lushan is the direct cause of the Tang's downfall, but he clearly is responsible for their weakened state that will lead to other revolts and their downfall 150 years down. The most interesting part is that if it wasn't for An Lushan, we could have had an industrial era China centuries before Europe. Story 34. The collapse of the Sassanid Persian Empire is pretty interesting for the ramifications. They got into a total war for it all with the Byzantine Empire, and were just about to snuff them out only for the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius to pull off one of the greatest comebacks in the history of mankind. The totality of the war left both empires so weak that the newly created Rashidun Caliphate wiped them out following the war and stole much of the land the Byzantines had fought to regain. Had this war not taken place, it's not out of the question to think that Islam could have remained a small regional religion, as the Zoroastrian Persians were a dominant force in the area. Story 35. Darius III was the last king of kings of the Achaemenid Empire, which ruled over 4% of the world's land area, and it was all lost in about 4 years to Alexander the Great. It's rare for an empire so large to fall in a single war or campaign. Alexander wasn't willing to stop with a peace that gave him half the empire like most empires would. Darius III wasn't terribly incompetent, like many who cause empires to collapse. He was just outmatched. I am surprised that nobody has mentioned this one,